So what my job is this morning is to just give you some very brief sort of 30,000-foot view information about the systems that we've created in Maine to deal with homelessness, and just a little bit about homelessness in Maine. This will not be Homelessness 101. Many of you already know that, and I'll be here all day, and so will Cindy. We'll be happy to talk with you about any questions that you might have. But I wanted to talk first about the systems that we've had in place here in Maine for the last 5 to 7 years to at least come together around tables like these to try to deal with all of the issues of homelessness that arise. And so almost 5 years ago, our governor and the Maine State Legislature passed legislation that created the statewide Homeless Council. And I chair that council on behalf of the governor's office. It is a 13-member council. It includes actually Commissioner Harvey's designee to that council from the Department of Health and Human Services. It includes the Department of Corrections Commissioner's person on that council who works directly for Marty Magnuson, the corrections person. It includes the Director of Maine Housing, Dale McCormick, and then it includes 3 representatives from each of the 3 regions of the state. And when I talk about regions, I'm talking about regions 1, 2, and 3 that mostly correspond with the DHHS regions 1, 2, and 3, although perhaps not exactly. But each of those regional homeless councils nominate 3 persons for the statewide homeless council who are then appointed by the governor and the legislative leadership. We serve in an advisory capacity to the governor, to Commissioner Harvey, to Commissioner Magnuson, to Maine Housing, and to the legislature on all matters pertaining to homelessness. I mentioned the 3 regional homeless councils. You can see them both in your packet and up here on the screen, the territory that they cover. Those councils bring, and some of you, I do recognize some of you in this room, and I know that some of you are regular participants in those homeless councils, which have the responsibility in each region for bringing together state agency folks, private nonprofit. There are many municipalities. I see some folks here from municipalities who participate in those councils. And also, most importantly, there has been a focus the last few years in bringing consumers of homeless services to the table, because we know that that's who we can learn most from about what it's like to experience homelessness, and then about what kind of responses are needed in order to both eliminate and reduce the homelessness in our state. So we do have the regional homeless councils, and I hope those of you who don't currently participate will begin participating, because we need folks from every single corner of the state in every discipline and in every circumstance of homelessness to be participants to help us. Because what I know is we could eradicate homelessness in Maine if we had the will to do so. And people will say, well, we don't have the money, or we don't have this resource or that resource. I think we have all the resources we need. It's a matter of how we deploy them, and can we do it or not. I think we can, and it's those regional and statewide homeless councils who will help us get there in this state. Then I would also just briefly mention that there are what are known as continuums of care, 3 of them in the state, and these are organized in the 3 geographic regions that you see up there. They're made up of many of the same people who participate in the homeless councils, but their very specific task is connected with the federal government, with HUD, and applying for doing the planning, and then applying for almost $10 million of funding that comes into Maine each year to work on issues of homelessness. And those are also great places for you to put your time and your energy, because that's where we really look at what is the need in our state, what is it that we have in terms of resources that is responding to that need, and then what are the gaps. And the continuums attempt to fill those gaps as new federal dollars become available. There are a lot of reasons for homelessness, and as we developed Maine's plan to end and prevent homelessness, we tried to, in some ways, categorize them a little bit. What do we most often see and hear about in terms of why folks become homeless? For the individuals who come into our homeless shelters, it's often substance abuse, it's often mental illness or mental health issues, it may be co-occurring disorders, it may be family conflicts, they've lost jobs, and always, for every homeless population, it's about housing affordability. And people who do have housing are ever more losing their housing because of the current economic situations. And people who don't yet have housing are finding it almost impossible to obtain housing, because homelessness is about poverty. And all of these populations, when they have other resources, don't end up in our homeless shelters. But it's when they don't have other resources, financial resources, they end up in our homeless shelters. So in order to get housing, you need housing subsidies, and there are very few of those available. There's lots of housing available these days, but there aren't very many vouchers that go with that housing that people can actually move into. For youth, and we identify youth in this state as ages 12 up to age 24. That is how our youth service providers who have come together to advise the statewide homeless council have asked us to identify youth. And most often for youth who are coming into our systems, into our shelters or into outreach service providers, it's often there's substance abuse involved, but certainly not always, or some family conflict, and often health and safety issues for the youth and what's happening to them in their families. So we have youth in this state who run away from the homes that they're in, who are kicked out of the homes that they're in, who are suffering abuse, the homes they're in, and so that has brought many of the youth into homelessness, either on the streets or in our homeless shelters. And I'm sad to say that they're more often on the streets than they are in our shelters. And while shelters are never a good place for anyone to be, the streets are even worse for anyone to be, as I think some folks will talk about later today. And they're particularly a bad place to be for our young people, because they get victimized also in ways that none of us would want to experience. And then for families in the state, there are a whole host of reasons why families become homeless. It has been true around the country, and it's also true in Maine, that any growth in the homeless populations that we've seen over the last few years has been in families, and more families coming into our shelters. It's almost always economic, of course, because they don't have other resources, but there are also family conflicts, there are employment issues, and of course, domestic violence issues. About 10%, varies between 10 and 12% of the folks who come into shelters here in Maine are coming into our domestic violence and safe home, domestic violence shelters and safe homes for victims of domestic violence. And so that may not have been an economic issue when it started out, and women and their children may be coming from families who are stable economically, but the moment that domestic violence occurs and they're needing to leave their homes, they are without resources. So that's what we're seeing. Our statewide homeless council developed a plan to end and prevent homelessness 2 years ago, and it has 4 focus areas, but for all of the focus areas, it is about leading to permanent housing. I've never spoken with someone experiencing homelessness whose first priority was anything different than, I need a place to live. I want a place that I can call home. And so that is always and foremost what we're talking about. And for some people, having that place to live also means having an appropriate level of services and supports that help them stay in that housing. And so without that, people will bounce back out of the housing. And certainly the focus of today and this symposium about brain injury and people experiencing brain injury, often without the appropriate supports, may get into housing and lose it again without supports.